Hello, today is Monday, 30th December 2024. Momentous events that took place during the last few months of this year, including the presidential elections in the United States and the war in Syria, overshadowed important developments in the news cycle, especially on the economic front. One of them is the approaching collapse of Great Britain. I believe that we are at the precipice of events that will remain recorded in history, perhaps like the 1921 Weimar Republic hyperinflation, 1929 stock market crash, or the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Such crises caused a lot of pain for a great many people, but if we prepare for the crises that lie ahead, at the very least we should be able to weather the storm intact. About 4 months ago, on 26th August, I published an article titled The Coming Collapse of Britain. If you missed it, give it a scan as it sets the backdrop to this report. During the year's summer months, British ruling establishment appeared to be in a panic over Ukraine's imminent military defeat and her debt default. Britain has invested quite massively in Project Ukraine, which now looks like a failed investment. Indeed, on 27th August, only one day after I published that article, Prime Minister Keir Starmer gave a speech in the Downing Street Garden in which he disclosed that there was a £22 billion black hole in the public finances. Supposedly, his government only discovered this once they came to power. By black hole, Starmer was referring to the government's unfunded liabilities. To prepare the nation for more bad news, the Prime Minister announced that the October 30th budget would be painful. Well, October 30th is now well behind us, and now we know. Deutsche Bank's analyst Sanjay Raja characterized the budget as one of the largest fiscal loosenings of any fiscal event in decades. In the post-war years, it was only surpassed in 2020 during the COVID-19 lockdowns. The new budget adds £142 billion in new debt, which the government expects to raise in capital markets. But the sheer amount of the planned borrowing took the markets by surprise. As it turned out, Britain's gross financing needs are double what market analysts had expected. The pain which Mr. Starmer promised will come not only in terms of savage austerity imposed on society's most vulnerable groups, but also in terms of £40 billion in new taxes. The burden of these new taxes will fall largely on British employers, which in turn will hurt the working people. Ultimately, however, it will also hurt the government. In suffocating the economy, the government will only widen the gap between the public spending and its tax receipts. Britain is already running one of the world's largest budget deficits. Bloomberg's analyst Simon White had a point when he judged the fiscal picture in Britain as catastrophic. Britain's Office of Budget Responsibility, or OBR for short, applied lipstick on the proverbial pig with some suspiciously rosy-looking forecasts. They projected the government's budget deficits will stay at around 2.5% through 2029. Inflation will stay perfectly under control, peaking at 2.6% in 2025, and then gradually falling back to 2% by 2029. The OBR also revised Britain's 2024 GDP growth rate from 0.8% to 1.1%. In 2025, the GDP growth will soar to 2%. Those figures might be a bit overly optimistic, however. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, recently downgraded Britain's economic prospects. They predicted that in 2024, the UK will end up having the worst performing economy among all the G7 nations, with an expected growth of only 0.4% in 2024, not 1.1%, and 1% in 2025, not 2%. But as it now turns out, even the OECD was much too optimistic. Namely, the official figures showed that the British economy actually shrank 0.1% month on month for 2 months in a row in September and October 2024. But there's more. To show itself in the best light, the government even resorted to bold financial innovation. They disappeared a large chunk of the public debt by simply redefining it. In doing so, the government gave itself £53 billion in extra borrowing capacity. If the capital markets embrace this bold 21st century financial innovation, then all governments, companies, and individuals around the world might want to follow suit. If you've maxed out all of your credit cards, additional borrowing headroom could be just a simple matter of identity politics. You could declare your debt as an asset and perfectly good collateral at that, and progressive creditors should have to respect and honor your choices. Who knows, perhaps we could achieve further advances by declaring that war is peace, slavery is freedom, vaccines are safe and effective, and that ignorance is strength. Unfortunately for the government, however, all these innovations failed to impress Mr. Market, who punished Starmer's profligate budget within hours by selling off the government's debt and adding 20 basis points to the interest rate on the 10-year British gilts. However, that reaction was quite minor compared to what happened in September 2022, when Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng presented the Truss cabinet budget. The so-called mini-budget shocked the markets with a £45 billion in unfunded spending commitments. Today, there's only £32 billion in unfunded commitments. There are, however, a few reasons why the situation today could be much worse than what Britain was facing in 2022. Back then, Britain was not yet as heavily invested in the war in Ukraine, and at the time, many people believed that Ukraine would win the war. This is no longer the case today. Also, in the summer of 2022, the interest rates on the 10-year gilts were well below 3%. Today, they're over 4.5% and rising. In fact, the sharp rise in interest rates since 2022 itself indicates that the situation could be much worse than we know. The most important indication that something was very wrong was the fact that Bank of England felt obliged to open its monetary spigots wide. Recall, on 22 July, they hastily introduced a repo program announced as a bold transition towards a new system of supplying reserves to financial institutions. This move was clear evidence that one or more of British financial institutions were about to collapse. We'll take a small detour here to talk about repos because it's important to understand what the repos are and why the Bank of England's launching a repo program is a very significant red flag. Repos or repurchase agreements are an important source of funding for large financial institutions. A repo is a form of borrowing where the borrower sells securities to the lender with an agreement to repurchase them at a slightly higher price. Simply, it's a form of secured loan. In the first step of the transaction, the lender buys some financial assets from the borrower. The assets also represent the collateral which secures the loan. Normally, the assets in question would be liquid, low-risk securities like government bonds, but they could also be mortgage-backed securities. In the second step, the borrower buys the securities back at a higher price. The difference between the sale and the repurchase price reflects the interest on the loan that's due to the lender. Repos are usually very short-term transactions, most often overnight, but they can also be arranged for longer time intervals spanning several days or weeks. They can also be open-ended with no term specified. As a rule, in repo transactions, the lenders are private, non-depository financial institutions or money market funds. For them, repo transactions are a lucrative source of investment returns as they earn reliable interest income in transactions that are almost risk-free. The borrowers are usually investment banks. For them, the repo market is a critically important source of liquidity. In the United States, over $1 trillion in repo transactions are conducted each day. During financial crisis, however, the repo market is one of the first to seize up. If a borrower is unable to repurchase the securities they sold, the lender might remain stuck with the collateral whose value could collapse during the crisis. In such conditions, the lenders might demand higher interest rates, or they might even be unwilling to engage in repo transactions altogether. In 2007, the global financial crisis was initiated by a run on the repo market. The funding for investment banks became either prohibitively expensive or entirely unavailable. In 2019, yet another financial crisis was about to hit the proverbial fan. In August that year, the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, James Bullard, said that something is going on and that's causing, I think, a total rethink of central banking and all our cherished notions about what we think we're doing. We just have to stop thinking that next year things are going to be normal. Well, as we now know, within a few months we got the new normal. Let's consider how things evolved back then. The repo rates in the United States have been rising steadily since 2015, but by 2019 that trend began to accelerate quite sharply. On 16 September, repo rates exploded to 8%, fully 6% higher than the Fed funds rate. To avert another, much bigger Lehman Brothers moment, the Fed hastily intervened as the lender of last resort, providing tens of billions of dollars in liquidity to the repo markets. The intervention was supposed to be only temporary, except it wasn't. Instead, it continued to expand from the initial $53 billion to more than $200 billion by the end of October. We don't know the full story, however, because like the British authorities today, the Fed kept things very obscure. Writing about this episode in January 2022, Fed watchers Pam and Russ Martins wrote that we've never before seen a total news blackout of a financial news story of this magnitude in our 35 years of monitoring Wall Street and the Fed. The reason for all the secrecy was that the problem was much bigger than we were told, and it wasn't limited to the United States. On Saturday, 19th October 2019, the World Bank Group and the International Monetary Fund held a meeting in New York. On the occasion, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that the world economy was in a tense and testing time, facing severe headwinds. He pleaded with the overlords of global finance to do everything possible to avert the great fracture in the world. By January 2020, we had numerous reports about the interbank lending and commercial credit drying up in Europe, banks issuing margin calls and cutting credit lines. It appeared that a massive financial crisis was imminent. But just then, a fortuitous event almost miraculously rescued the banking system. World Health Organization declared the COVID-19 pandemic, creating the perfect smokescreen for the bankers to stage a veritable global banking coup followed by the largest ever bailout of the entire Western financial system. In the US, the CARES Act was passed, providing a $6.2 trillion stimulus package for the economy. That's almost $20,000 per man, woman, and child living in the United States. To their credit, the U.S. lawmakers somehow had the amazing foresight to introduce this act into congressional record already in January of 2019, more than a year before the pandemic was declared. Ultimately, the total bailout gifted to the bankers exceeded $10 trillion, more than $30,000 per man, woman, and child living in the United States. That sum clearly dwarfed the Fed's repo facility, but the repos were essential in averting the collapse in September 2019. Thanks to their opacity and complexity, repos saved the day as a sort of Swiss Army knife in the banker's survival toolkit. For example, they can serve as a means of perpetual bailout. Among others, Lehman Brothers systematically used repo transactions to conceal their investment losses and create for a time a false impression of liquidity. For central bankers, repos can be a covert mechanism of monetary policy. The Reserve Bank of India routinely uses repos and reverse repos to increase or decrease money supply in the economy. Today, it seems that we are at the precipice once more. Keir Starmer's budget represents the largest fiscal loosening since the 2020 lockdowns, and the Bank of England is flooding the financial system with liquidity. It is fair to ask then, how bad could things be in the United Kingdom? I don't really know the answer to that question. As a market analyst and a former hedge fund manager, I regularly read the financial press, as I've done for over 25 years. But during that time, I couldn't help noticing that UK's public finances aren't subject to the same level of scrutiny as those of other nations. We hear a lot about the US, Japan, Germany, France, or China. About Britain, not so much. What we can find from the public sources isn't exactly sensational. We already know that the UK's government debt is high and rising. In 2023, it was nearly £116 billion, 27% more than the year before. UK's Office of National Statistics says that the government added over £64 billion in deficit spending through August 2024, and that the debt-to-GDP ratio reached 100%. These figures are bad, but they're hardly panic-inducing stuff. I suspect that the real state of things is much, much worse, which is why it is being deliberately concealed. There are times, however, when some truth breaks into the public view through political squabbles. For example, on May 1 this year, Keir Starmer confronted then Prime Minister Rishi Sunak about the £46 billion black hole before correcting himself first to £64 billion and then to a staggering £71 billion. Whatever the case, the black hole is there and it is almost certainly much bigger than we know. It's suspicious that by the time Starmer became Prime Minister, the hole had magically shrunk to only £22 billion, the sum that may be small enough that it could be fixed in part by freezing a few thousand pensioners this winter. Incidentally, what is this financial system that requires a limitless flow of free money to gorge the gods of finance, while at the same time it inflicts savage austerity on the poorest and most vulnerable members of society, condemning many of them literally to death? Whatever these gods of finance are, they clearly demand human sacrifice. Our liberal democracies fear these gods enough that they are prepared to appease them at an industrial scale. To save about £1.4 billion, Sir Keir Starmer has decided to cut winter fuel subsidies to 10 million pensioners in Britain. Back in 2017, Tory Prime Minister Theresa May floated a similar proposal. Back then, Labour was in opposition and their own research concluded that cutting winter fuel allowance would kill nearly 4,000 pensioners that winter. That was 5 years before typical household energy bills increased by 54% in April 2022 and another 27% in October of that year. Britain now has the highest cost of energy in the world, and the required human sacrifice could turn out considerably higher than 4,000 pensioners, all to save a relatively insignificant sum of money, a mere 1.4 billion of the supposed 22 billion fiscal black hole. And to be sure, Sir Keir was almost certainly lying about the size of that black hole. Massive government spending on unproductive, ideologically driven pet projects had created a £50 billion black hole already in 2022. The cost of COVID countermeasure was £9 billion. Government's Orwellian track and trace program cost £37 billion. In addition, vast sums are being spent on various net zero schemes. Just in 2022, the government spent nearly £13 billion on mitigating the impact of climate change, whatever that is. Furthermore, at the beginning of October 2024, they announced that they'd allocate another £22 billion for carbon capture projects, where carbon would be captured from the atmosphere and stored underground, wasting billions on completely unproductive projects far into the future. The government also added £2.9 billion to Britain's defence budget, a 4.5% increase over last year's budget and more than double as much as they are saving by freezing thousands of pensioners. Then there's the illegal immigration black hole. Supposedly, the upkeep of illegal immigrants costs the government £8.5 billion per year. The real cost almost certainly is much, much higher. Back in 2009, we were told that the cost of immigration was £12.8 billion that year. In 2016, they said it was £17 billion, and since then, the number of immigrants increased by more than 2 million. So the cost of their upkeep would not have halved since 2016. Most likely, it would have increased, and dramatically so. Then there's the all-consuming Project Ukraine. From February 2022 until now, Britain allegedly spent more than £13 billion in aid to Ukraine. But the real damage from this misadventure has been many times higher. Sanctions against Russia have caused extensive damage to Britain's economy, starting with a sharp increase in prices of energy and other inputs. Farmers report that the cost of fertilizers has quadrupled, from £250 per tonne before the sanctions to £1,000 per tonne today. Many British companies lost business on account of sanctions. Just one example was British Airways' cancellation of one of its most important routes, the 4 times weekly direct flight from London Heathrow to Beijing. In a retaliatory measure against British sanctions, Russia closed its airspace to British commercial flights, rendering the flight to China uncompetitive and simply surrendering the business to BA's Chinese competitors. There are probably hundreds or thousands of similar cases where business relationships that may have taken years and decades to develop have been blown up over the ruling establishment's geopolitical obsessions. It would be difficult to quantify all these effects, but in June 2023, European High Representative for Foreign Affairs Josep Borrell gave us an important clue. Here's what he said in his remarks to the Shangri-La Dialogue Forum in Singapore. For the first time ever, we have been funding military support to a country under attack. If you add up all the support, military, civilian, economic, financial, and humanitarian, the level of support to Ukraine is about 60 billion euros for Europe. But let me show you another figure which is really impressive. If you include the support that the European governments have had to pay in order to help their families and firms to face the high prices of electricity, of food, the subsidies to our people in order to face the consequences of the war is 700 billion euros, 10 times more than the support for Ukraine, which shows that the consequences of this war are not reduced to what's happening in Ukraine, but to the shockwaves that the war has been sending all around the world. If the shockwaves Borrell was talking about hit Britain as hard as they hit the European nations, the full cost of Project Ukraine could be £150 billion, or they could be even higher. Keep in mind, Borrell made his assessment only halfway through the Ukraine war. However high the real damage is, all that capital has already been flushed down the drain and will likely never be recovered. In all, the situation in Britain is certainly far worse than we know. That view is supported by the over-the-top Orwellian actions by the Starmer government and the Bank of England. What we have in a nutshell is an overhang of unpayable debts, growing government deficits, hard austerity, increasing militarization, continued foreign adventurism, and an expanding monetary inflation by the Bank of England. I must add, however, that since I published my August article, I did wonder if I wasn't mistaken to single out the UK as the most vulnerable economy. So I checked the capital markets verdict on the situation by comparing the recent performance of the British, German, and American government bonds. Sure enough, thus far the markets appear to agree with me. Over the last 4 years, British government's debt has performed the worst of the three. Germany's debt has done marginally better, and the US bonds, as could be expected, have been the least affected. Over the coming months and years, Britain could be the first among the G7 economies to capsize and plunge into a deep crisis of stagflation and ultimately hyperinflation. If that is so, could we profit from the coming changes? Making broad brush predictions is one thing. Navigating the changes successfully requires some skill and a method. But skilling up could be worth it. I believe that the unraveling of this crisis will be for the history books. Arthur Burns said that a subtle understanding of economic change comes from a knowledge of history and large affairs, not from statistics or their processing alone. Indeed, it was just this understanding of history and large affairs that led me to make the prediction about the fall of Britain already in October of 2021. Back then, I wrote as follows. The UK will likely make all the mistakes made by other powers in that similar position through history. It will suffocate its domestic economic growth by imposing hard austerity at home, while at the same time increasing military spending and foreign adventurism. Britain's public debt will continue to outpace its GDP growth, and the government's budget deficits will be covered by Bank of England's monetary inflation. This recipe reliably leads to stagflation and possibly to hyperinflation. This is exactly what started to unfold over the last 3 years. For the record, I wrote the above before the war in Ukraine even started, adding tens of billions in new debt. It was before Boris Johnson pre-announced the war in his cryptic speech on Monday, 15th November of that year. Addressing the attending dignitaries at the City of London banquet, then Prime Minister Johnson issued a warning to the European governments. We hope that our friends in Europe may recognize that a choice is shortly coming between mainlining ever more Russian hydrocarbons in giant new pipelines and sticking up for Ukraine and championing the cause of peace and stability. How Johnson knew that this choice was shortly coming remains a mystery, But the fact that he did know and that he included that announcement in his remarks was very significant. It suggested that Britain took the leading role in Project Ukraine and gambled heavily on it. That gamble went badly wrong, and the bills are now coming due. That is what induced the panic in the British establishment ranks. Project Ukraine only accelerated Britain's decline, but that decline has already been long in the making. In my 2021 article, which was titled The Fall of Global Britain, an Investment Hypothesis, I made the following specific predictions. At a macro level, we can expect the following developments over the coming months and years. Asset prices will probably continue to rise, i.e., a bullish cycle for the FTSE 100. But the government bonds will continue to slide along with the British pound. Here's how some of these predictions panned out thus far. Broadly, my prediction was correct, but the price changes didn't unfold exactly along straight lines. This is normal. Markets don't do what we think they should do from the moment we become aware of some fact. Markets are driven by the collective psychology of their human participants. Large-scale price events only begin to unfold when a critical mass of them adopt a certain view. This is why large-scale price events are unpredictable, and the challenge of navigating them profitably is not trivial. One thing we do know about large-scale price events, however, is that they unfold as trends that can last weeks, months, or even years. In The Art of War, written more than 2,000 years ago, Sun Tzu said that there are three great avenues of opportunity: events, trends, and conditions. In the current British crisis, we seem to have all three of these avenues converging. The financial and economic conditions are causing events which will trigger great trends which could be for future history books. Here's how German imperial Bund fared through the dying days of the Weimar Republic. Of course, such events are only obvious in hindsight. How to navigate them in real time is far from obvious. The most reliable way to do so is by relying on quality trend following strategies. Trend following cuts through the information overload straight to the final product of financial analysis. Clear, actionable decisions that will keep you on the right side of important trends in any market. That is precisely the kind of decision support we offer through our daily iSystem Trend Compass reports. Trend Compass is based on time-tested algorithms that my team and I developed 25 years ago and have used daily ever since. They helped us generate a stellar track record in live trading, and today these same algorithms are generating the signals you can receive daily through Trend Compass reports. They will tell you when to go long, when to go short, when to cut your losses, and when to take profits in any market. In over 2 decades, we have never once failed to capture windfalls from significant trends, whether in bull or bear markets. Today, you can receive real-time trend following signals by subscribing to one of our Trend Compass reports. Recently, we pre-launched a Trend Compass report on Substack covering 16 key global markets, which include the British pound, British gilt, and the FTSE 100 stock index. The Substack report is priced at only $29.50 per month or $295 per year. That is less than $1 a day for top-notch trend following signals on 16 global markets. To learn more about Trend Compass reports and sign up, visit iSystem Trend Compass on Substack or our website at iSystem Trend Following. As 2024 is drawing to a close, I wish you an excellent start in the new year with prayers for good health, happiness, prosperity, and peace. Perhaps 2025 will see a great transformation begin to unfold in Britain with the collapse of the old imperial establishment. If so, good riddance. It could be a good thing, and better still if we can profit from its collapse and set off into the new normal intact and capable of contributing to the building of a better system, more conducive to people's happiness and prosperity. Thank you for spending time with me today, and I'll see you soon with a new report. Until then, mind the trends, keep well, and stay free.